The first modern electric car was not a Tesla, it was an EV1. But if he was so innovative, efficient, and capable of changing the future of mobility, why did he disappear without a trace? Who was really interested in making sure this car never reached the masses? What happened to him was not a simple market error, nor a commercial decision. It was the intentional erasure of history, a meticulous plan to destroy a technology that could have changed everything. Imagine a completely silent car that did not emit pollutants, that needed little maintenance, and was already on the streets in the late 90s. The EV1 proved that electric cars were viable, but strangely, they all disappeared, one by one, as if they had never existed. And the question that few ask themselves is, who gained from this? The last time an EV1 was seen working, it was in the hands of a select group of drivers who are passionate about the vehicle, people who knew they were driving something revolutionary. But suddenly, everyone received notifications that their leasing contracts would be terminated. No convincing explanation was given. General Motors did not want to sell the cars. He didn't allow collectors to buy them. There was no option for them to continue running. They needed to disappear. But why? Documents revealed years later show that there was immense pressure from the oil industry to ensure that electric cars did not become popular. Billion-dollar companies, which dominated the fossil fuel sector, saw the EV1 as a direct threat. If this car proved that gasoline was dispensable, what would stop the world from abandoning fossil fuels? This could have accelerated the transition to an electric future decades earlier than the one we are experiencing now. But this revolution never happened. What I'm about to tell you was erased from history. You will never see this story being discussed in the big automakers. You won't see this issue on the covers of automotive magazines of the time, because the disappearance of EV1 was not a mistake. It was an industrial murder, a car that had to be eliminated to maintain the dominance of the oil giants and the traditional automobile industry. And now comes the big question: is this still happening? If the electric market still faces challenges today, wouldn't it be because the same forces that destroyed the EV1 continue to try to block this change? If you want to continue discovering hidden stories like this, subscribe to the channel now, because it may be that the next time you look for this video, it won't be here anymore. General Motors knew the future could be electric long before Tesla. In the 90s, while the automobile industry was still betting all its money on combustion engines, GM surprised the world by presenting a car that looked like something out of a science fiction film, the EV1. This wasn't just another prototype or a distant concept. The EV1 was a fully functional electric car, produced and put on the streets to run, with technology that could have accelerated the transition to a world without dependence on fossil fuels. The impact was immediate. The EV1 didn't need gasoline, era silent, had a driving smooth and futuristic, and its maintenance was minimal, as it did not have the dozens of moving and wearable parts of combustion engines. He was powered by an innovative drum set for the time, which offered a range of up to 160 kilometers, more than enough for the daily use of most urban drivers. But this technology didn't stop there. The second generation of the EV1 came even more powerful, equipped with nickel metal hydride batteries, which doubled this autonomy. The first drivers who had the chance to drive an EV1 were impressed. The car was practical, fast, and provided a completely different experience to anything on the market. But the most shocking thing was the fact that this vehicle, developed in the 90s, already solved many of the problems that modern trams still face today. The EV1 wasn't just a viable alternative to gasoline cars, it was better, more efficient, cleaner, cheaper to maintain, and this finding left many people worried. The market's first reactions were disbelief. The oil still dominated the world, and the idea of a car that could run without gasoline seemed like a direct attack on the biggest companies on the planet. But consumers didn't care about that. Once the EV1 began to be offered on restricted leases in California and Arizona, queues started to form. Thousands of people wanted to test this new car, experience what seemed like a glimpse of the future. The promise of a world powered by electricity, it finally seemed within reach. If GM had managed to manufacture such an efficient electric car in the 90s, what would stop other automakers from following the same path? What would prevent, in a few years, gas stations from starting to disappear, replaced by an electric charging network. What would prevent the collapse of the fossil fuel industry? The EV1 had everything to be the first step towards a revolution. But then, something started to go wrong. Shortly after the EV1's launch, strange signs began to emerge. Despite the high demand for the car, GM drastically limited its production, claiming that there was not enough demand. Even with full waiting lists, the automaker refused to manufacture new units. Furthermore, the leasing program was extremely restricted. Drivers couldn't just buy an EV1. They had to sign rental contracts, and even those who were willing to pay to keep the car after the lease ended were prevented from doing so. This decision seemed completely illogical. Which company, when creating an innovative product, sees great interest from the public and decides not expand its production? The only explanation for this attitude was that there was something going on behind the scenes. The specialized media began to notice that GM wasn't promoting the EV1 like it should. There were no massive advertising campaigns. The car was not widely publicized as a revolutionary advancement. Instead, the automaker itself began to act as if it wanted the project to fail. And it was at that moment that suspicions began to be confirmed. The forces that have always dominated the automobile and energy markets began to move. About the EV1 was not just a promising electric car, he was a threat. And when something becomes a threat to the world's most powerful industries, drastic measures are taken to eliminate it. GM began to silently sabotage its own project. The charging infrastructure for EV1, which should be expanded to make electric vehicles more viable, was abandoned. Charging stations that had been installed in some cities began to be deactivated without explanation. And even more suspiciously, research to improve EV1 batteries has been halted. While all this was happening, GM executives began meeting with major oil corporations and lobbyists from the traditional automotive industry. Reports at the time indicate that pressure against trams increased every day. If EV1 were successful, automakers would need to change their business model, abandoning decades of investment in combustion engines. Furthermore, oil companies would face a fatal blow: the drastic reduction in demand for gasoline. What came next was a sequence of decisions that they didn't make commercial sense, but they made perfect sense within a larger conspiracy. Suddenly, GM announced that would not expand the EV1 program. Lease contracts would not be renewed. And, scariest of all cars had to be returned to the manufacturer. People who were driving an EV1 rioted. Some tried to negotiate the purchase of the vehicle, offering large amounts of money, but GM refused all offers. No matter how much someone was willing to pay, no EV1 could remain on the streets. Cars began to be collected and transported to secret warehouses. Journalists tried to find out what was happening, but all information was blocked. The mystery grew. Why was such a revolutionary car being phased out like this? What happened in the following days was confirmation that something much bigger was behind it. The EV1's fate was sealed in the most brutal way possible. But that's what we're going to find out in the next part of this investigation. The rise of EV1 has not gone unnoticed. On the contrary, the unexpected growth of the electric car began to bother billionaire interests. The automobile industry, consolidated for decades around combustion engines, and the oil industry, which generated trillions of dollars globally, realized the real risk that small electric car represented. The EV1 proved that it was possible to live without gasoline, that a vehicle could be efficient without needing oil for lubrication, without changing filters, without exhaust, without noise, and without combustion. It was a silent and lethal threat to an entire chain of businesses that had existed since the beginning of the automobile era. Executives at major automakers began to realize that if the EV1 was to be successful, the entire structure of the industry would need to change. They couldn't just turn their backs on this revolutionary car and expect it to disappear by itself. So what happened behind the scenes was an orchestrated mobilization to prevent the electric car from having any chance of thriving. Meetings began to take place between oil industry leaders, CEOs of traditional automakers, and powerful lobbyists. It was necessary to slow down EV1 growth before it was too late. The first phase of this attack was not straightforward. General Motors, which had created the EV1, started acting like he was sabotaging the product itself. Production was limited. with very few units being made available to the public. Despite great demand, GM insisted that not enough consumers were interested. But that didn't make sense. There were waiting lists, queues of people wanting to drive an EV1, and yet the automaker did everything to prevent the vehicle from reaching more drivers. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, regulations began to be changed. Pressure from the oil industry on politicians and legislators started to have an effect, and some laws that encouraged the development of electric cars began to be revised. In the United States, California, which had established rules forcing automakers to produce zero-emission vehicles, began to suffer intense pressure from groups linked to the fossil fuel sector. Traditional automakers claimed that this legislation was unfair and unrealistic, arguing that electric technology was not viable for the mass market. But who really financed these attacks against electric vehicles? Who was behind these campaigns that said that electric cars were not practical, that their batteries did not last, that recharging was an insurmountable problem? A pattern began to emerge. Big oil corporations and auto parts companies were financing studies, reports, and advertising campaigns to discredit electric cars. Articles began to be published in newspapers and specialized magazines, questioning the viability of electric cars. Independent studies emerged, supposedly showing that batteries were unreliable, that production costs were unsustainable, that electrics had no future. But when you looked closely, many of these studies had something in common, were financed by companies that profited from combustion engines. At the same time, rival automakers have started releasing extremely limited electric vehicles, purposely defective or inefficient, to reinforce the narrative that this technology was not yet ready. Models with little autonomy, outdated design, and excessive recharge times were launched just to create the impression among the public that electric cars could never replace gasoline cars. This was part of the strategy to discredit EV1 and the entire nascent electric vehicle industry. The attack was not limited to the media. Some oil companies began to acquire patents for more advanced batteries and simply blocked its development. One of these technologies, nickel metal hydride batteries, which were already being tested for the EV1, were purchased by a subsidiary of an oil giant. Thus, the advancement of batteries was blocked before it even reached the market, ensuring that electric vehicles continued to be seen as an unviable solution. And while this war raged behind the scenes, GM continued to silently sabotage the EV1. Public charging stations began to disappear. Many of the stations that had been installed in the early phases of the program simply have been removed or disabled without explanation. The company already knew what would happen next. The final phase of this conspiracy began when General Motors announced that the EV1 would be discontinued. All cars would need to be returned at the end of the leasing contracts. No units could remain with the drivers. No sales would be permitted. The vehicles would be collected and, officially, the automaker stated that they would be evaluated and dismantled for future studies. But the reality was much worse. EV1 owners started receiving notifications to turn in their cars, even those who were willing to pay any amount to maintain them. Protests began to emerge. Small groups of drivers tried to resist. Some refused to return the vehicles, while others asked that at least some units be preserved for history. But GM didn't give in. Shortly afterwards, images began to emerge. The EV1s were being destroyed. One by one, the vehicles were taken to secret warehouses and crushed by hydraulic presses, turned into scrap. There was nothing left. The first modern electric car had been written out of history. What happened next only confirmed the suspicions of those who followed this story closely. General Motors executives left the company and went to work for the oil industry. New campaigns against electric cars began to emerge, ensuring that this technology would be discredited for another few decades. But in the midst of this destruction, a young businessman was paying attention to it all. He understood that if no one faced this resistance, electric cars would never return to the market. And he decided that I wouldn't let that happen again. General Motors began recalling EV1s with an official statement that made no sense. They claimed that the cars were just prototypes, that the program was never intended to become permanent, and that the company was simply ending an experiment. But how could they call prototypes cars that were being used daily by satisfied drivers, vehicles that had been extensively tested and had already proven to be viable. Something didn't fit with this narrative, and those who had had the privilege of driving an EV1 knew it. The uprising began to grow, and suspicions that something much bigger was happening behind the scenes became impossible to ignore. EV1 owners couldn't believe what they were hearing. Not only were they notified that they needed to return their cars, but they were also told that no units would be offered for sale. Drivers willing to pay absurd amounts to maintain their EV1 were repeatedly refused. GM did not accept proposals. The car simply needed to disappear. Why was a company that had developed an innovative product trying so hard to prevent it from continuing to exist? The EV1 was not a commercial failure. There was a waiting list. There were passionate drivers. There was potential. But that didn't matter. What mattered was making sure the world never knew how efficient and revolutionary it really was. The return of vehicles began to happen gradually. Each EV1 collected was sent to unknown locations, away from the public eye. Some were taken to testing centers, others to General Motors' own warehouses. But soon, rumors began to emerge. Where were the disappearing cars? Some drivers tried to track their EV1s after they were returned, but there were no public records of what was being done with them. Every day, more units were taken off the streets, and every day it became clearer that these cars were not being stored for study or research. Something much bigger was happening. Protests began. Activists, environmentalists, and electric technology advocates came together to try to stop the cars from being recalled. Groups gathered in front of GM facilities demanding that EV1s be sold rather than destroyed. Some drivers refused to hand over their vehicles, trying to hide them or blocking recovery teams. But GM was determined. One by one, the EV1s were confiscated, and none of the protests were enough to stop the fate that had already been decided for them. The first clues that something even more serious was happening came when journalists began to investigate what was behind this decision. The pressure to end the EV1 didn't just come from GM. The company alone would not be interested in eliminating a car that it had created. But who would profit most from the disappearance of trams? The first suspect was obvious: the oil industry. Oil companies have always had a direct relationship with the automobile industry. Since the beginning of the 20th century, they have funded advertising campaigns to make gasoline-powered cars the only viable alternative. The disappearance of EV1 prevented a collapse in fuel demand, and Big Oil knew that the only way to maintain their empire was to ensure that electric cars were discredited before they could threaten their billion-dollar profits. Later documents and interviews revealed that oil companies were among those that pushed hardest for the EV1 to be phased out. But they were not alone. The United States government also played a key role in this conspiracy. Laws and regulations that encouraged electric cars began to be changed or simply eliminated. California, one of the pioneering states in requiring zero-emission vehicles, came under intense pressure to repeal this legislation. With the change in regulations, automakers were no longer obliged to produce electric, and GM took advantage of this loophole to kill EV1 once and for all. But that still didn't explain a central issue. Why destroy the EV1? Even if GM wanted to end the program, it could have simply sold the vehicles to collectors or donated them to research institutions. But that wasn't the plan. The plan has always been to ensure that no evidence of the success of trams survives. Cars were being removed from the streets not just to stop their growth, but to erase any trace that they worked perfectly. That's when the first shocking images started to leak. Photos showed EV1s parked in large gated lots, surrounded by barbed wire. Then, even more terrifying records emerged. Tractors and hydraulic presses were crushing the cars. The EV1s were being destroyed one by one, reduced to piles of crushed metal. The first modern electric car was being annihilated in a systematic and calculated manner. The revolt exploded. Environmental activists attempted to physically intervene to stop the destruction. People chained themselves to the warehouse gates, trying to save the last remaining EV1. But nothing was enough. The order had already been given, and no one could prevent the end that had been set for those cars. What no one imagined, however, was that a few EV1 units would manage to escape this fate. Some were stolen from warehouses before destruction, others were hidden in universities and museums. A very small number of EV1s still exist today, but most have never been driven again. The cars that weren't destroyed have had their batteries removed, ensuring that they would never work again. The conspiracy against EV1. It wasn't just an attack on a specific model of electric car, but rather an attack on the very concept of electric vehicles. If the EV1 had been allowed to grow, the auto industry could have been electrified decades earlier, and dependence on gasoline would have declined long before the rise of Tesla and other brands. If this video made you see the story in a different way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, just so you don't miss the next videos where we will continue exposing the conspiracies that tried to bury the evolution of mobility. And if you want to know how other technologies have also been sabotaged in the past, watch the next video that is appearing on your screen right now. Decades later, documents and investigations revealed that the disappearance of the EV1 was not a simple case of a car that did not find its place in the market. The official story has always been that the EV1 was unviable, that consumers weren't interested, and that the technology wasn't ready. But now, we know that none of that was true. The EV1 did not disappear by chance. He was strategically eliminated to protect the interests of the oil industry and large automakers. As the years passed, it became increasingly evident that electric cars have always been viable since the 90s, and that the destruction of the EV1 was not a commercial error, but rather a deliberate act to prevent a revolution that could have happened much earlier. The EV1 was efficient, quiet, economical, and, most importantly, did not depend on oil. He proved that combustion engines were not indispensable, and that was his biggest crime. When the world finally began to accept electric cars as a real alternative, it became clear how much sabotage had been done. The resurgence of electric vehicles proved that the EV1 was years ahead of its time. Today, we see electric cars driving everywhere with increasingly longer ranges, faster charging, and onboard technology that impresses anyone. But what if this revolution had started decades earlier? What if EV1 had survived? What would the world be like now? The answer to that question is scary. If trams had followed their natural path, it is very likely that today gasoline was a thing of the past. The EV fossil fuel market would have shrunk much sooner, and cities would have been free from pollution caused by combustion engines. But this revolution was postponed. The world lost at least 20 years of advances in electric mobility. We lost time, we lost technology, and we lost the chance to live on a less polluted planet much sooner than we are trying to do now. And it is at this point that a question arises. Does Tesla only exist today because the EV1 was destroyed? This is a theory that has been gaining strength over time. When Elon Musk invested in Tesla, he knew there was a vacuum in the market. He saw that the automotive industry was not willing to go down the electric path on its own. He knew that if he wanted to change history, he would have to force that change. But what would have happened if EV1 had continued? Would General Motors have dominated the electric car market and become the global reference in this technology? Would Tesla even have existed? In the end, if the EV1 had thrived in the 1990s, traditional automakers would have been forced to compete and invest heavily in electrification long before Tesla was even founded. What can we learn from this conspiracy? The biggest lesson from this story is that technological advances are not always hindered by technical limitations, but rather by financial interests. EV1 didn't fail because it was unviable. He was sabotaged because its success would mean gigantic losses for companies that built empires on oil. This same strategy has been used other times. How many other technologies were buried because they threatened billion-dollar industries? How many innovations have been postponed or simply destroyed to maintain the profit of those in control? But what does this story teach us about the future? Could something similar still happen? The growth of electric cars seems inevitable now, but will this transition happen in the way we hope, or are there still forces trying to slow down this change, just as they did with EV1? If you want to continue exploring the conspiracies that shaped the world of transportation and discover other technologies that have been sabotaged, don't miss the next video. Click now on the video appearing on your screen and see how another innovation was erased from history before it even had a chance to change the world. Now, I want to know your opinion. If EV1 had survived, would the world be different today? Comment below. The electric revolution should have started earlier. I read all the comments and want to know what you think about this. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.